Hello readers, I'm Amy and I've already filmed this and of course I deleted it on accident because I didn't realize that I hadn't saved it to my computer, so I'm going to try this again. I have a couple of Unhaul clips that I have already filmed in like the last couple of months. So we will start with those and then I'll be back to drag you through the rest of my large pile because I have moved recently and decided I need to purge myself of some books that I either didn't enjoy that much or will just never get around to reading. So first, past Amy. Hey, just jumping in here really quick with some books that I'm gonna unhaul. Right now it's gonna be Margaret Atwood. Sorry, Victoria. Really sorry. I have been in a book club this year where currently it's What the Book Club Read with Victoria from What Victoria Read. Currently we are focusing on all of Margaret Atwood's novels and reading them in publication order. And at this point, it's the end of September. We're supposed to read Alias Grace this month, and I started it, and I've been in a weird space with reading this month, to be fair, but I'm just not feeling it. And I'm thinking at this point, there's been like 2 books by Margaret Atwood that I have truly enjoyed, and I'm thinking her writing style maybe just isn't my thing. Like, she's just not my thing, and I have to face that. So I have Alias Grace, The Blind Assassin, and Oryx and Crake, and I'm gonna go ahead and unhaul all 3 of these. 2 of them were actually Christmas gifts last year. Sorry, Mom. Sorry it didn't work out. I know there's a lot of people out there who are looking for Margaret Atwood, who enjoy Margaret Atwood more than I do, so I'm gonna go ahead and find some new shelves for them to go on. Hello readers, I'm Amy. The library has opened again, so I can start doing unhaul vlogs again, instead of just doing one video and then putting everything in the trunk of my car and then forgetting about it. Firstly, in my last haul revisit, I talked about House of Leaves and how it was sitting on my shelf as just a way to remind me of everything that I tried to accomplish and how far I got with this. And this is actually, 2 weeks after I made that video that I'm already doing some unhauls and stuff. But I have a friend whose birthday is coming up, and on her list of books that she wanted is House of Leaves. And I'm not gonna try reading this again, but also I've written in it enough that I can't just give it to the friends of the library or to the library itself because they won't take books that are written in, which is fair. Hi, buddy. So I am going to wrap it up and give it to that friend. And Dimitri is going to send his love with each and every book because he likes to rub his face on them. Thanks, buddy. So yes, this is going as a gift to her. Let's see. The Existence of Amy. I got this sent to me from the author for review, and I read it, and I really enjoyed it. The writing is a little simplistic for my taste, even though I think it worked really well for this story. And while I did enjoy this, I think it's going to be important for me to give this to the kids that I work with, because I think that they're going to get a lot out of this. This being a story of mental illness, largely OCD and some depression. I think this will be great for the kids to read at the psychiatric residential treatment facility that I currently work at. Then I have What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Blacker. This is a book on race that I saw at Barnes & Noble and bought on a whim. And I just have really mixed feelings on it. I like the writing. I like the author. I think he had some really important things to talk about. I really enjoyed the first 2 essays in this. It's basically about how race has affected his life. However, a lot of it just didn't hit with me. Rather than being a book on race from a person of color written to white people, it feels more like a race book by a person of color for people of color. It sounds more like, hey, here's my experience, maybe you can relate to it, rather than here's my experience, learn from it. And that could just be that I'm from Montana and therefore to a lot of people I'm considered uncultured swine. I haven't lived in LA. I was in San Francisco for a very short period of time in high school. I've been to Portland like once. I don't really like New York. I'm not in those areas. I'm not in the super cultural areas. Montana is very white. And most of the cultural references in this book I didn't understand or didn't hit me. So I do think it's a really great book. I think it's written really well. It's just not a race book that is meant for me, if that makes sense. Then I have Hitler's Charisma. I got this at a sale a couple of years ago, and I've been wanting to read it because, like, Hitler's Charisma, that's an interesting title, and let's learn about how Hitler captured the minds of millions, even though he was a terrible person. But the one time I tried to read this, I was really bored with it, and I watched a documentary that I realized was filmed or directed or something by the same author that did this book, and that documentary was the most boring World War II story that I have ever watched. And the more it sits on my shelf, the more I realize I'm just not going to get around to it. Also, this writing is tiny. Like, just make a thicker book. So I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to that. My copy of Mein Kampf, I had gotten this on sale from the Friends of the Library because I was intrigued. I'm like, it's Mein Kampf. I want to know what the hell Hitler was thinking. What was on his mind? What did he have to say? This is another book, kind of like Hitler's Charisma, where I feel like it's going to be boring, and it's something that I think is going to be more interesting than it probably is. Also, I've just had it with shitty people, and I've had it with 2020, and I don't want to add any more of that to my life. Welcome back to the future, to the present, to whatever time it is. All right. Which pile to start on? Start over here. Michael Crichton's 5 Patients. This is a book about how hospitals worked in, like, the 80s. It was a good book. I always like Michael Crichton. I'm probably not going to read this again. Stephen King. Rose Madder is probably the worst Stephen King book that I have ever read. And Dolores Claiborne was fine, but I'm not going to read it again. Most of our Stephen King books I ended up picking up for my husband because he tends to really like Stephen King. He says he's not going to read these. I don't think he would like them anyways, so they're going. Friend Demi from Weird Reads, you should totally... Friend Demi from the Weird Collection, she has her own channel. You should totally go follow her. She reads a lot of dark and twisted stuff, and she said that she will take this book. Sickened. I have been wanting to read this for about 2 years now for Mental Health-a-thon. I finally got a copy. Victoria, from what Victoria read, she's like, it's kind of a tough read, and I'm like, oh, but I can do tough reads. No. For any of you who, like me, decided to torture yourself by reading A Child Called It, Sickened is like one step down from that. I will say there's a gynecology scene, and she doesn't understand what's going on. And that's when I decided I couldn't read this book anymore. So I got like 50 pages into it. It was well written and everything. I'm just like, I can't do the medical stuff. Interview with the Vampire. Considering I just did Vampathon and I'm really into some good vampire literature, you'd think that I would have actually read this already. I haven't seen the movie. I've seen like bits and pieces of the movie. I've never watched the whole thing. It just seemed needlessly long and drawn out. I've read maybe a third of the book, also seemed needlessly long and drawn out, so I don't think I'm ever going to read it. I Am Legend. This is actually a collection of Richard Matheson's stories, and it starts off with I Am Legend. I could have sworn that the movie was a zombie movie. No, ends up it's about vampires. So I'm like, oh, maybe I'll read the short story. It wasn't good for me. Like, I was getting into a weird headspace in October, and whenever I actually read this, it kind of made it worse. So just based on memories of where my headspace was when I read this, not super into it. Also, really sexist. Like, I'm surprised that I Am Legend has gotten as good reviews as it has, considering the things that he says about the female zombies and what he wants to do to them, even though they're terrible and he shouldn't be thinking, like, why? Why do you need to go there? Why is that necessary? Virginia Woolf. Yes, I'm keeping Mrs. Dalloway on my shelf just because the cover is pretty, and I shouldn't do that anymore because I'm not going to read this. I read probably halfway through it. It's very stream of consciousness. I, for the most part, loathe stream of consciousness. It's just not a writing style that works for me. And while I appreciate that Virginia Woolf is a feminist literature icon, I've never liked anything that she's written. I've never finished anything that she's written. The writing style is old enough that I can't get into it. Those of you who've been here for a while know that I am trying to read through the Bronte sisters. I finished Anne Bronte's books, and I was going to start on Charlotte Bronte's books next. I have started Shirley probably 3 or 4 times. I've never gotten past the first chapter because it's going on about some priests living in this society, and I don't care. The style seems interesting enough, the way in which it's written, but I just don't care. And it kills me because I hear lots of great things about Shirley, and it seems like a really interesting plot and very, very feminist. But it also starts off saying the novel is set in a period of social and political ferment, featuring class disenfranchisement, the drama of Luddite machine making, and the divisive effects of the Napoleonic War. Now, the feminist stuff sounds cool. That sentence that I just read puts me to sleep, and I don't care. And I don't want to give this up, but it's like, I'm not going to read it. I need the space on my shelves. I need to move on. Katharine Hepburn's Me. I do love a good memoir or autobiography. This book has been on my shelf long enough that it's just not at the top of my list. I don't know that I'm ever going to get around to it. Katharine Hepburn was a cool person, but there are other celebrities that I get more excited to read, and I just don't know that I'm ever going to get around to that. So, going to move on from it. Sex and the City, the most hated book that I own. Literally, the reason I have owned this for as long as I have is because I hated it so much. The show is good. The show did not age well, considering some of the politics of it and the way it discusses some things, but I'm still entertained by it. The book is so bad. It's supposed to be like a collection of newspaper articles, but they don't feel like they go together. They're not always talking on the same topics. You don't have like a continuous recurring character, really. You will have one column that lasts about a paragraph and another one that lasts several pages. So the consistency and length is really bothering me because I've worked for a newspaper before, and you generally want about the same length for each of your weekly columns. So there were so many things that I hated about this. I'm keeping it on my shelves as a hate book, and I need to just not do that and move on with my life. And The Band Played On. I picked this up after going to Rhode Island for one summer because I met a student from Brown who was reading it, and it just seemed like a smart person kind of thing to own. I'm never going to read this. I am interested in the topic of AIDS. I'm sure that this is a very, very important work on the topic, but really it feels to me just like a huge chonker of a book, largely about politics, and that just doesn't interest me. AIDS is the kind of thing I'll probably learn more about it on my own time rather than reading this enormous book. Sex Work, I read this earlier this year. It was good enough. It's a little bit outdated. I enjoyed some of the essays. It wasn't like a 4 or 5 star for me. The second half of the book I never actually finished because it's information on different areas of like prostitution that are just very outdated. I don't really have a reason to hang on to it anymore. Victoria, I'm sorry, I'm letting go of The Edible Woman. I actually did enjoy this. Besides The Handmaid's Tale, it's the only other Margaret Atwood that I've read that I've really, really loved. Or not really loved, but that I've really, really enjoyed. But being literary fiction, I don't know that I'm ever going to pick this up again. I have loved some literary fiction, but it is extremely hit and miss for me. Usually miss. And I just don't see myself picking this up again. It just didn't have a lot of action to it. Tattooist of Auschwitz. This book didn't know what it was doing. I'm thinking, it's a cute little love story, and it's about one of the people who was tattooing the Jews. That sounds like a really interesting story. And it was based on a true story, but I picked it up thinking that it was a nonfiction, and it wasn't a nonfiction. It was just based on interviews that the author did, but it was actually a fiction. Like, I wanted this book to just pick a side. And as interesting as the second book sounds, it's not really a sequel. Like, I think it's still a World War II book, but I wouldn't call it a sequel to this story. As interesting as it looks, the writing in this just wasn't that great. I don't know. I every time I look at this book, I want it to be good. I want to know that I can read it again and I'll enjoy it. But I know that it was just disappointing, and I don't know why I'm holding on to it anymore. Memoirs of Cleopatra, probably the biggest book that I own. This has been on my shelf for a couple of years now. I've never read Margaret George. She does a lot of kind of historical fiction based around female characters. I know there's one on the Helen of Troy that she has. Never read her work. I loved Cleopatra growing up. I still think she is a fascinating person. But I'm also at that point, this is my thing with big books in general. I have quite a bit of Brandon Sanderson now because I know I enjoy him as an author. I haven't tried Margaret George yet. She doesn't tend to write very short books. And like, as much as I love learning about Cleopatra, just what are the chances of me reading a 1,000-page book and of it being more than 3 stars? 3 stars is not a bad rating. 3 stars is a very solid book. But if I'm going to read 1,000 pages, I want to know that it's going to be at least 4 stars. Otherwise, it's like, why bother with the investment? Philip Roth. I have 2 books by Philip Roth. I got the Portnoy's Complaint a couple years ago that I read. And he's one of those authors, he writes about really controversial subjects, which is why I wanted to read him, but realistically, Portnoy's Complaint wasn't actually a very good book. It was kind of tiresome and racist and sexist and weird, and I don't know why I've been holding on to these books as long as I have. They should go. A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius. I think I've heard decent things about it, but I still don't know what it's about. It's been on my shelf for probably 4 or 5 years now, and I'm like, it's always, oh, I'll pick that up someday, never, I'll pick that up right now. So realistically, I'm never going to read this. It should just go. Lastly, Henry James. I have a history with Henry James. Portrait of a Lady, I started reading a couple of years ago, and it seemed interesting enough. I was keeping track of the summary on Wikipedia, just to make sure that I could hold up with the language. And it wasn't as bad as some of his other stuff that I've tried to read. Like, Turn of the Screw, I can't read. I can't do it. The writing is too old for me. It's that literature style that I cannot understand what is going on in that story. I didn't understand any of it. Portrait of a Lady, as usual, I don't really care about spoilers, so I read ahead on the summary and I got really upset with how it ended and decided that it could sit on the shelf and think about what it did for a little bit. I'm interested in reading it, but am I ever really going to pick it up? And then considering how Turn of the Screw went, and I think I also read the Aspirin Papers, I just don't like his writing. I can't understand what is going on. It's not writing that agrees with me. So I'm just going to get rid of these 2 because why have them? 2 more books. 2 more books? 3 more books. The Gilda Stories. I read this for Vampathon in October. It was good and it wasn't. Like, I liked the way it talked about race and sex and queerness. Like, it was good in that sense, but it was it really is the Gilda Stories. It's like a collection of stories in the couple centuries life of this vampire and exploring different historical time periods. And that's interesting, but it's not an adventure. There's not really one main storyline. I just wasn't really invested in it when I was reading it. So like it's good. It's just not what I was really looking for. And I have a friend to give it to who will love it. 2 other books that I don't actually have with me, Helter Skelter, which I gave away to a friend and did not film the Unhaul for. It's one of those nonfiction that reads like novels, and I'm interested in that idea. I just don't. Helter Skelter is not super high on my list. and the other one is actually The Lady from the Black Lagoon, which is about Millicent Patrick, who designed the monster from the Black Lagoon, the creature from the Black Lagoon. And I don't know why I didn't think about doing this before, but if you are familiar with some of my previous episodes, I love the I Don't Know Her podcast. It's hosted by Rita Vigil and Amanda Mead. I will have a link to their website down below. It's amazing. And they talk about women that you probably never heard of, but you should have, and now you will. Because I basically memorized that opening. And I got to thinking, like, I enjoyed that book. I don't know that I'm going to read it again anytime soon. And I'm like, you know who would love that? Amanda and Rita, especially Amanda. Amanda loves film. I don't know how they feel about horror films specifically, but I'm like, I bet they would love this story of Millicent Patrick. Also, the author, Mallory O'Meara, is feminist as fuck. So, I got Amanda's address and I sent it off, and I'm so excited to see what they think of it. So, excited for that one. I believe that's it for this unhaul. Hopefully this isn't like 30 minutes long, but please like, subscribe, be my friend on social media, and I will see all of you in my next video because I'm going to be uploading more regularly, I swear.